There is a beach on the eastern shore of Oak Island, Nova Scotia, that should not exist. Not in the way most beaches shouldn't exist. Eroded, endangered, slipping into the sea. This beach shouldn't exist because it was built, and what it was built from has never been explained. Smith's Cove sits at the edge of a small island in Mahone Bay, a stretch of cold Atlantic coastline where winters arrive early and stay long. For most of recorded history, the Cove looked like any other rocky inlet along the province's shore. Unremarkable, windswept, forgettable. It drew no particular attention until treasure hunters in the mid-19th century began digging near the waterline and found something beneath the sand that stopped them cold. Spread across the cove's floor, just below the surface, lay a thick, compressed mat of coconut fiber, brown, coarse, unmistakable, not scattered fragments, not a few loose strands carried in by current, a deliberate engineered layer stretching across the entire cove like a filtration membrane buried under a manufactured beach. The problem is botanical before it is historical. Coconut palms do not grow in Nova Scotia. They do not grow anywhere in Canada. The nearest natural source of coconut fiber lies thousands of miles to the south in tropical latitudes that share nothing with the freezing, fog-bound coastline of the North Atlantic. Coconut fiber does not drift to Nova Scotia on ocean currents. It does not appear naturally in maritime Canadian soil. Its presence beneath Smith's Cove is not a mystery of probability. It is an impossibility, unless someone brought it there. That is the question that reframes everything about this beach. Not how the fiber arrived, though that defies easy answers. The deeper question is why. Why would anyone construct an artificial beach on a remote island? What lies beneath a shoreline that someone at some point in history decided the world was never meant to see? Beneath the coconut fiber, the excavators found something worse. Not worse in the sense of danger, worse in the sense of implication, because what lay below that artificial beach was not random, it was engineered. 5 box drains, hand-cut from stone, fanned outward beneath Smith's Cove like the fingers of an open hand. Each channel was carefully constructed, flat stone bottoms, stone sidewalls, capstones laid flush across the top. Between and around the stones, layers of eelgrass and coconut fiber had been packed tightly. They're functioning as a filtration system designed to allow seawater through while keeping sediment out. The drains ran inland from the cove, converging as they went, narrowing toward a single point deeper on the island. That point would later become known as the Money Pit. The design is not subtle. It is a hydraulic delivery system. Seawater enters the drains at the shoreline, filters through the layered organic material, and flows inward through the converging stone channels toward whatever lies at their meeting point. The engineering is deliberate, precise, and most disturbingly, defensive, because the system does not supply water to anything. It weaponizes it. If anyone were to dig a vertical shaft at the convergence point, the drains would activate. Seawater would flood the shaft from below, filling it faster than any crew could bail. The deeper the dig, the greater the pressure. The system does not merely conceal, it retaliates, and this is where the logic fractures. A trap implies a prediction. Whoever designed this system did not simply bury something and walk away. They anticipated discovery. They calculated that someone someday would find the site and begin to dig, and they built a countermeasure calibrated to make that excavation fail. Who engineers a defense against a future they will never witness, and what could possibly require it? The story that most people know begins with 3 boys and a hole in the ground. But what matters more is what the story doesn't begin with. because there is no before. In 1795, a teenager named Daniel McGinnis rode to Oak Island and found something strange in a clearing on the island's southeast end. A large oak tree stood with one of its heavy branches sawn cleanly off. From the cut limb hung an old ship's tackle block, the kind of pulley used aboard sailing vessels to hoist cargo or heavy rigging. Directly beneath the block, the earth had settled into a wide circular depression, as though something below had collapsed or compacted over time. McGinnis returned with two friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan. They began to dig. 2 feet down, they struck a layer of flagstone, flat, placed, unmistakably deliberate. Beneath the flagstone, they found a shaft, roughly 13 feet in diameter, with walls of hard-packed clay. Every 10 feet, they encountered a platform of oak logs, laid horizontally across the shaft, fitted tightly edge to edge. They dug through platform after platform, eased descending 30 feet before the scale of the project overwhelmed them. They left, planning to return with resources. The island waited. What no one could explain then or now was the absence that surrounded the discovery. The tackle block implied organized human labor. The shaft implied sustained, large-scale excavation. The log platforms implied engineering knowledge and purpose, and yet no written record of any kind documented prior activity on Oak Island. No colonial settlement, no military outpost, no logging operation, no naval garrison, nothing. The island had no history before the moment it was found. Every document, every land survey, every regional account treated it as empty. The written record does not describe and then forget Oak Island. It never mentions the island at all. And the silence is total. And it starts at the beginning. 8 years passed before anyone returned to the shaft with enough resources to go deeper. In 1803, a group called the Onslow Company arrived on Oak Island with laborers, timber, and the kind of confidence that comes from believing a problem is simply mechanical. They re-excavated the original shaft, cleared the collapsed platforms, and pushed downward past the 30-foot mark, where the 3 boys had stopped. At 60 feet, they found more log platforms. At 80 feet, a layer of putty. At 90 feet, they hit something flat. And then the ocean came in. Seawater surged into the shaft with a speed and force that no natural groundwater leak could explain. Within hours, easier as the water had risen to a level roughly 33 feet below the surface, the exact height of sea level at the nearest shoreline. The crew attempted to bail. Buckets were lowered and emptied in frantic rotation. It made no difference. The water held its level with mechanical precision, rising and falling slightly with the tide, as though the shaft were breathing in rhythm with the Atlantic itself. The flooding was not accidental. It was not the result of hitting an underground spring or breaching a water table. The shaft had been connected to the ocean by design, and the connection had been dormant, waiting until the dig reached the depth at which it was meant to activate. This is the moment the Onslow Company stopped thinking about treasure and started thinking about the builders, because the flood system required knowledge, serious, technical, applied knowledge. Whoever constructed it understood tidal pressure, water volume, hydraulic gradients, and the precise relationship between shaft depth and sea level. This was not the work of someone burying a chest in haste. This was defensive engineering on a scale that, for the region and the era most commonly proposed, should not have been possible. Just before the flood, at approximately 90 feet, the diggers reportedly pried loose a flat stone unlike anything else in the shaft. It was smooth, heavy, and bore carved symbols across its face, characters that no one present could read, and no local scholar could identify. The stone was removed from the pit and preserved, or so the accounts claim. What happened next depends on who is telling the story. One version holds that the stone passed through several hands before ending up in the possession of a Halifax bookbinder named A.O. Creighton, who allegedly displayed it in his shop window for years, face outward, where weather and handling gradually wore the carving smooth. Another version suggests the symbols were transcribed before they faded, and that a professor later decoded them as a substitution cipher reading, 40 feet below, 2 million pounds are buried. The translation is dramatic. It is also unprovable because the original stone has vanished, not deteriorated, not crumbled, vanished. The single most important artifact ever removed from the money pit, the one object that carried a direct message from whoever built the shaft, simply disappeared from the historical record while sitting in a bookbinder's window. No photograph was taken, no museum claimed it, no inventory lists it after a certain point. It is gone. What remains are the accounts, and on one fact, every account agrees, the stone was real. Multiple witnesses across different decades described it. Its existence is not in serious dispute, but its absence is, because the loss of this stone is either the most negligent act of carelessness in the history of the Oak Island investigation, a priceless cipher-bearing artifact treated as a doorstop, or it is something else entirely, something deliberate. The kind of disappearance that happens not because no one was paying attention, but because someone was paying very close attention indeed. After the Onslow Company failed, another company came, and then another, and then another. For over 200 years, the pattern has repeated with the reliability of tide. A new group arrives on Oak Island carrying better technology, deeper funding, and absolute certainty that they will succeed where every predecessor failed. They dig, they drill, they pump, and they are stopped by flooding, by tunnel collapse, by the sheer financial weight of fighting an island that seems to have been designed to win. The Truro Company came in 1849 and drilled into the flood tunnels. The Oak Island Association followed in the 1860s and attempted to block the water at its source. The Halifax Company tried dynamite. Later groups brought industrial pumps, steel caissons, and eventually modern sonar and drilling technology worth millions of dollars. Each generation believed its tools had finally surpassed the ingenuity of the builders. Each generation was wrong. Near 6 people have died in the attempt. The island has consumed fortunes, reputations, and lifetimes, and yet no one stops coming. The failures do not discourage. They magnetize. Every collapsed tunnel is read as evidence that something important lies just beyond reach. Every flood is interpreted as proof that the defense system is guarding a prize worth defending. But there is a question buried inside the obsession that almost no one pauses long enough to ask. Every failed excavation has assumed the same thing, that the structure exists to hide treasure, gold, silver, jewels, something that can be weighed and counted and spent. But what if that assumption is the oldest mistake in the story? What if the shaft, the flood tunnels, and the artificial beach were never built to protect something valuable, but to protect something dangerous? Once before dawn on October 13th, 1307, sealed orders were opened simultaneously across France. Soldiers acting on the authority of King Philip IV moved against every Templar commandery in the kingdom in a single coordinated strike. Arrests, seizures, interrogations beginning before most of the accused had finished morning prayers. The charges were severe: heresy, idol worship, denial of Christ, obscene initiation rituals. The evidence was largely extracted under torture. The motive, however, was not spiritual, it was financial. The Knights Templar had grown into one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. What began as a monastic military order protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land had evolved over 2 centuries into a vast network controlling land, castles, farms, and, most critically, an international banking system that made the order creditor to kings. Philip IV owed the Templars enormous sums. Destroying the order meant destroying the debt. The arrests were thorough. Thousands of Templars were taken across France, and the Inquisition extracted confessions that would later be used to justify the order's formal dissolution by Pope Clement V in 1312. Grand Master Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake in 1314. The order officially ceased to exist, but something had gone wrong with the plan. When Philip's soldiers arrived at the Templar naval base in La Rochelle, the order's primary Atlantic port, they found the harbor empty. The entire fleet, estimated at 18 vessels, had departed before the arrests began. No manifest recorded the ship's destination. There was no harbor along the French coast reported their arrival. No wreckage was ever recovered from any shoreline. An entire naval fleet carrying unknown cargo sailed out of La Rochelle and into a silence that has lasted 700 years. The disappearance of the Templar fleet is not a footnote. It is a fracture in the historical record, a gap so complete that it resists every attempt to close it. The Templars were experienced mariners. Their naval operations spanned the full length of the Mediterranean and extended into Atlantic waters, supplying their network of commanderies, transporting troops, and, according to several historians, running commercial shipping routes that reached as far north as the British Isles and Scandinavia. A fleet of 18 ships was not a minor asset. It represented significant tonnage, experienced crews, and the logistical capacity to move large quantities of material across open ocean. And yet, when that fleet left La Rochelle, it left no trace. No port authority along the Atlantic coast recorded its passage. No allied kingdom acknowledged receiving the ships. The order's own naval records, if they existed, were either seized and destroyed during the suppression, or were carried aboard the fleet itself, vanishing along with the vessels. The most widely discussed theory is that the fleet was warned, that senior members of the order learned of Philip's planned arrests days or weeks in advance and organized a quiet evacuation of the treasury, the most sensitive documents, and possibly key personnel. If this is true, then the departure was not panicked flight. It was a planned extraction, disciplined, timed, and directed toward a predetermined destination. One destination has drawn more attention than any other. In 1307, Scotland, under Robert the Bruce, was in open defiance of Rome. The country had been excommunicated, placing it beyond papal authority and, crucially, beyond the reach of the Inquisition. Templars fleeing France would have found Scotland to be not just safe harbor, but sovereign sanctuary. There is circumstantial evidence that some Templars did reach Scotland, but if the fleet arrived carrying the order's accumulated wealth and its most guarded secrets, no Scottish record says what happened next. About 7 miles south of Edinburgh, in the village of Rosslyn, stands a 15th century chapel that has never stopped generating questions. Rosslyn Chapel was founded in 1446 by Sir William Sinclair, a Scottish nobleman whose family had deep, documented connections to both the Templar tradition and early Freemasonry. The chapel took 40 years to build and was never finished. Only the choir was completed, a fraction of the intended structure. But what was completed is among the most densely decorated interiors in all of European architecture. Every surface inside Rosslyn is carved. Pillars, arches, window frames, and ceiling bosses overflow with figures, foliage, and symbols of bewildering variety. Among them are depictions that have troubled art historians for over a century. Certain carvings appear to represent maize, ears of corn with a distinctly New World morphology, and others resemble aloe vera, a plant native to the Americas. Both are rendered with a botanical specificity that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence or artistic abstraction. The chapel was built between 1446 and 1486. Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492. If the carvings are accurate representations of American plants, then someone connected to the Sinclair family had encountered these species decades before any officially recognized European voyage across the Atlantic. The implications are self-evident, and they have never been resolved. Beneath the chapel floor lie sealed vaults. Ground-penetrating radar has confirmed the existence of chambers below, and historical accounts describe metallic coffins and other objects interred there centuries ago. Yet the vaults have never been fully opened. Requests to excavate have been denied or indefinitely postponed. Whatever the Sinclair family placed beneath Rosslyn Chapel remains exactly where it was left, sealed, silent, and surrounded by carvings that suggest someone in that bloodline knew about a world that Europe had not yet discovered. In 1558, a Venetian nobleman named Niccolò Zeno published a collection of letters and a map that he claimed had been written by his ancestors, two brothers also named Niccolò and Antonio Zeno, describing a series of voyages undertaken in the late 14th century under the command of a northern prince. The prince, as identified through the letters, was Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney and Lord of Rosslyn. The voyage described took place in 1398. Its destination was westward across the open Atlantic, nearly a full century before Columbus unfurled a sail. The Zeno narrative is detailed. It describes the expedition departing from Orkney with a small fleet, making landfall on unfamiliar shores, encountering indigenous peoples, observing harbors and coastline geography, and exploring wooded terrain with natural features unlike anything in northern Europe. The descriptions include tidal patterns, vegetation, and distances between points that, when mapped by later researchers, align with striking specificity to the eastern coastline of Nova Scotia and portions of New England. Henry Sinclair was not an obscure figure. He was a Scottish Norse nobleman of significant political standing, connected by blood and alliance to families with deep ties to the Templar tradition. His control of Orkney gave him access to some of the most experienced North Atlantic sailors in the medieval world, men who routinely navigated between Scotland, Norway, Iceland, and possibly beyond. The capability for a transatlantic voyage existed within his reach, and yet no contemporary Scottish, Norse, or Venetian source outside the Zeno letters confirms the expedition took place. There is no mention in Sinclair's own records, no entry in Orkney's administrative documents, no corroboration from any independent chronicle of the period. The Zeno narrative stands completely alone, either an authentic account of a pre-Columbian Atlantic crossing preserved through a single family line, or a 16th century fabrication built on geographic guesswork that happened to be right. There is no comfortable position between the two. Roughly 600 miles south of Oak Island, in the small town of Westford, Massachusetts, a flat rock ledge bears markings that have divided researchers for decades. The image, if it is an image, appears to depict a figure in medieval armor, legs extended, arms positioned at its sides, with what some interpret as a broken sword across the body, and a shield bearing heraldic devices consistent with the Sinclair clan of Scotland. The carving was first brought to modern academic attention in the 1940s, though local knowledge of the rock and its markings extends further back. Proponents argue that the figure's proportions, armor style, and shield design are consistent with a late 14th century Scottish knight, precisely the period of the alleged Sinclair voyage. The broken sword in medieval tradition signifies a knight who died far from home. If the reading is correct, the Westford Rock is a memorial carved by companions who buried one of their own on foreign soil and marked the site in the custom of their culture. Critics counter that the markings are glacial scratches and natural weathering patterns, enhanced by imagination and selectively interpreted to support a predetermined theory. They point to the erosion of the rock surface, the ambiguity of several key features, and the absence of any other confirmed medieval European artifact in the immediate area. The debate has not been settled by any definitive geological or archaeological analysis, but the location is what makes dismissal difficult. Westford sits along a plausible coastal route from Nova Scotia into New England, exactly the path a ship following the Zeno narratives described geography would trace. If the carving is pareidolia, it is a remarkably specific instance of it, producing a culturally coherent image in precisely the place where the theory predicts one might appear. Coincidences like that do not prove anything, but they do not feel accidental either. In Touro Park, in the center of Newport, Rhode Island, stands a round stone tower supported by 8 columns forming arched openings at its base. It has stood there for as long as any colonial record can confirm, and possibly longer, which is precisely the problem. The conventional explanation attributes the tower to Benedict Arnold, the colonial governor of Rhode Island in the 1660s, who referred to a stone structure on his property in his will. Most mainstream historians accept this attribution and classify the tower as a colonial windmill. The matter officially is closed, except the architecture will not cooperate. The tower's rounded arches, its double-splayed windows, and its proportional measurements correspond not to English colonial mill design, but to medieval Norse and Scottish ecclesiastical construction. The unit of measurement embedded in the tower's dimensions appears to match the Scottish ell rather than the English foot. The fireplace on the tower's interior wall has no functional purpose in a grain mill, and the overall form, a round stone tower on columned arches, echoes church architecture found in Orkney and Scandinavia, regions directly connected to the Sinclair sphere of influence. The carbon dating has been attempted on mortar samples from the tower, and the results have refused to settle the argument. Some samples return dates consistent with the colonial period. Others reach back into the 1400s, placing the tower's construction well before any documented English presence in Rhode Island. The conflicting ranges have been attributed to contamination, sample error, or the use of older materials in later construction, explanations that explain everything and resolve nothing. If the earlier dates are accurate, the Newport Tower predates colonial America entirely. And if it was not built by colonists, then someone else stood on that ground, cut those stones, and raised those arches for a purpose that no surviving record has ever described. Fred Nolan spent decades on Oak Island, and not as a television personality or a weekend enthusiast, but as a surveyor, a man whose profession was the precise measurement of land. He acquired property on the island in the 1960s and began doing what no treasure hunter before him had thought to do systematically. He mapped the ground, not for shafts, not for flood tunnels, for patterns, and in the arrangement of 5 large cone-shaped boulders scattered across the island's interior, he found one. The boulders were granite, each weighing several tons, and they were not where nature would have left them. Their positions did not correspond to glacial deposit patterns or natural erosion pathways. They sat in deliberate isolation, spaced across the landscape at intervals that, when plotted on a survey grid, deform the shape of a Latin cross, the long axis stretching over 700 feet. From end to end, the scale alone is disorienting. A 700-foot cross is not something visible from the ground. Standing beside any single boulder, a person would see only a large rock in a clearing. The shape emerges only from above, from an aerial perspective, or through the precise triangulated measurements of a trained surveyor. Whoever placed these stones did not design the cross to be seen. They designed it to be found, but only by someone who already knew how to look. Nolan documented the cross's alignment and noted its correspondence to specific astronomical and geographic bearings. The orientation was not random. It pointed towards something, referenced something, or encoded something into the island's topography at a scale that implied not just labor, but planning. The kind of planning that requires instruments, mathematical knowledge, and a reason to embed a sacred symbol into a remote Atlantic island where no church was ever built and no congregation ever gathered. The shape of the Nolan cross is not unique to Oak Island. It is unique to a tradition. Researchers who examined the proportional relationships between the 5 boulders, the ratios of the cross's arms, the distance between its center point and its extremities, the angular relationships between its axes, found correspondences that pointed in a single and very specific direction. The sacred geometry of Templar ecclesiastical architecture. Templar churches and chapels across Europe were not built according to arbitrary design, and they followed geometric systems rooted in mathematical ratios, proportions derived from classical and biblical sources, encoded into floor plans, column spacing, and nave dimensions. These ratios were not decorative, they were doctrinal. The geometry was the theology expressed in stone rather than scripture, and the proportional system governing the Nolan cross appears to follow the same principles. The cross's arm ratios correspond to measurements found in known Templar constructions in France, Portugal, and the Levant. Its orientation aligns with conventions used in Templar chapel placement. The relationship between its center and its endpoints mirrors the geometric logic of specific Templar floor plans that have been extensively documented by architectural historians. The match is not vague, it is dimensionally specific, and that specificity is what makes dismissal difficult. A cross shape alone proves nothing. Crosses appear across cultures and centuries, but a cross whose internal proportions replicate a particular medieval geometric tradition placed on an island already linked to Templar engineering through flood tunnels and artificial beaches occupies a narrower evidentiary space. The match could be coincidence. It could be the product of researchers imposing a favored framework onto ambiguous data. But with each additional point of correspondence, the coincidence requires more effort to maintain than the connection it is trying to avoid. The Nolan Cross was not the only geometric formation on Oak Island. Separate from the 5 boulders, investigators documented a large triangle constructed from stones on the island's surface, its sides aligned with apparent precision, and its angles corresponding to navigational or directional bearings. The triangle had been noted by earlier searchers, but largely dismissed as incidental, a natural arrangement or the remnant of some forgotten property boundary. It was only when the triangle's geometry was analyzed alongside other markers that its potential significance sharpened. At Smith's Cove, near the site of the artificial beach and the box drains, a series of holes had been drilled into the bedrock. The holes were uniform in diameter, evenly spaced and arranged in patterns that some researchers argued were not structural but informational, encoding directional data, marking sight lines, or serving as reference points for a larger survey grid. Individually, any one of these features might be explained away. A triangle of stones could be natural, drilled holes could be colonial, a cross of boulders could be coincidence. But taken together, the markers begin to behave like components of a single system. The triangle's bearings intersect with the Nolan cross at meaningful points. The drilled holes at Smith's Cove align with sight lines extending toward the money pit. The cross's orientation references geographic coordinates that connect to the triangle's geometry. The island starts to read less like terrain and more like a diagram, a survey system of considerable sophistication designed by someone who intended to return or intended someone else to follow. Yet there is no trace of the surveyors themselves, no habitation site, no fire pit, no tool fragment, no post hole, no midden. Whoever laid this geometry across Oak Island did so with extraordinary care and then removed every physical trace of their presence, leaving only the measurements behind, as though the math itself was the message. Step back now and look at the island hole. The money pit sits at the convergence of the Smith's Cove flood system. The flood system is fed by box drains hidden beneath an artificial beach. The Nolan cross stretches across the island's interior in Templar consistent proportions. A stone triangle encodes directional bearings. Drilled holes in bedrock mark sight lines that intersect with both the cross and the pit. Each element, discovered separately over 2 centuries by different people with different methods, appears to reference and reinforce the others. This is not the signature of a burial. A burial requires a hole, a deposit, and a covering. What exists on Oak Island is an integrated spatial design, a system in which the landscape itself carries information. The flood tunnels protect access, the geometric markers define location. The cross provides orientation. The drilled holes in the triangle refine the coordinates. Together, they do not simply hide something. They encode it. The implication is extraordinary and deeply uncomfortable for conventional archaeology. If the island is an artifact, a constructed object designed to function as a map, a key, or a spatial cipher, then the treasure is not what lies at the bottom of a shaft. The treasure is the island's design itself. The question is not where to dig, but how to read what has been written in stone across 700 feet of North Atlantic ground. But every artifact has an author. Every design has a designer. Every map is drawn by a hand belonging to someone with a name, an origin, a motive. And on Oak Island, that author is nowhere. Not in the colonial record, not in indigenous oral tradition, not in any naval log or military dispatch or private correspondence from any century. The island speaks clearly in geometry and is absolutely silent about who taught it to speak. The most popular theory is always the most convenient one. For generations, the default explanation for Oak Island's money pit has been pirates, specifically Captain William McKidd, whose name has been attached to the island like a brand. The story is appealing in its simplicity. A notorious pirate buries his plundered treasure on a remote island, and centuries of searchers try to dig it up. It fits neatly into the adventure narrative, so it requires no specialized knowledge to understand, and it is almost certainly wrong. William Kidd was a Scottish-born privateer who operated in the late 17th century under commissions that blurred the line between legal maritime warfare and outright piracy. His career was brief, his profits modest, and his end ignominious. Arrested in Boston in 1699, shipped to London, tried, and hanged. Before his arrest, Kidd did bury a quantity of treasure on Gardiner's Island off the coast of Long Island. It was recovered almost immediately by colonial authorities. The total value was notable but not extraordinary. Nothing in Kidd's documented movements places him near Nova Scotia. Nothing in his financial records suggests wealth on a scale that would justify the Oak Island works, and nothing in the operational reality of Golden Age piracy, short-handed crews, leaky ships, constant pursuit by naval forces, supports the idea that any pirate captain could have designed and constructed a multi-level shaft with hydraulic flood defenses, an artificial beach, and a network of stone-lined drainage channels. The engineering alone would have required hundreds of laborers working over months or years. Pirates did not have months. They barely had weeks. If not pirates, then perhaps the builders were professionals. Military engineers attached to one of the colonial powers that contested the Atlantic seaboard during the 17th and 18th centuries. The British and French both maintained garrisons in Nova Scotia. Both employed engineers capable of significant fortification projects, and both had motive to conceal assets during wartime. The theory is more respectable than the pirate legend, and for a time it held scholarly traction, but the records do not support it. British military archives from the colonial period are extensive. Garrison logs, engineering dispatches, supply requisitions, troop movement records, and naval correspondence from Nova Scotia have been preserved in considerable detail. French records from Acadia, while less complete, still document major construction projects, fortification efforts, and resource allocations across the region. Neither archive contains any reference to significant activity on Oak Island, no construction order, no labor requisition, no supply manifest, no engineering report. This is not a trivial absence. Just a project on the scale of the Oak Island works, excavating a shaft over 100 feet deep, constructing 5 stone-lined drainage channels, manufacturing an artificial beach, engineering a tidal flood system, would have required substantial material, manpower, and time. Timber would have been consumed in enormous quantities. Stone would have been quarried and cut. Workers would have needed food, shelter, and payment. Ships would have transported supplies. Every one of these activities leaves a documentary trace in a functioning military bureaucracy. None appears. The silence is made more conspicuous by the island's geography. Oak Island is not hidden. It sits in Mahone Bay, visible from the mainland, accessible by short boat crossing. A military operation conducted there over a period of months would have been observed by settlers, fishermen, and indigenous communities. Yet no account from any source describes unusual activity on the island before 1795. The colonial theory does not merely lack evidence, it requires the complete failure of every record-keeping system in the region, military, civilian, and indigenous, simultaneously and permanently. There is a discomfort that comes with ruling things out. When the familiar explanations fall away, what remains is not clarity, but exposure, the unsettling recognition that the question is larger than the available answers. Pirates cannot account for the engineering. Colonial military powers cannot account for the silence. Privateers, smugglers, and merchant adventurers cannot account for the scale, the sophistication, or the sacred geometry embedded in the island's design. What remains after elimination, it is a profile, yet the builders of the Oak Island works possessed transatlantic naval capability, the means to reach Nova Scotia from Europe or beyond. They possessed advanced engineering knowledge, including hydraulic systems underground construction, and large-scale surveying. They possessed a motive for secrecy so absolute that they erased every physical trace of their presence while leaving the structure itself intact. And they operated before the 18th century because the works were already old and unknown when three boys stumbled onto the money pit in 1795. The number of organizations in recorded history that satisfy all four criteria simultaneously is vanishingly small. Most proposed candidates fail on at least one count, but one group, disbanded, dispersed, and officially erased from history in the early 14th century, fits the profile with a precision that is difficult to dismiss and impossible to confirm. The Knights Templar had the fleet. They had the engineering tradition, refined across 2 centuries of fortress construction in the Holy Land. They had wealth beyond reliable estimation, and after October 1307, they had the most powerful motive for secrecy imaginable: survival. A fleet that vanished from La Rochelle, a bloodline that built Rosslyn Chapel, a voyage that may have reached Nova Scotia a century before Columbus. Each thread is circumstantial, but they converge on the same island, the same cove, and the same unanswered question. The Knights Templar are remembered most often as warriors and bankers. They are less often remembered as builders, which is a significant oversight because what they built across the Levant during 2 centuries of continuous presence in the Holy Land represents some of the most ambitious military engineering of the medieval world. And within that engineering tradition lie techniques that should sound familiar by now. The Templar fortress at Atlit, known as Castle Pilgrim, stood on a narrow peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean south of Haifa. Constructed in the early 13th century, it was the order's most formidable stronghold in the region, a complex of massive seawalls, towers, and fortified enclosures that withstood repeated siege. But its most remarkable features were not visible from the surface. Beneath the fortress, the Templars constructed subterranean vaults connected to the sea by channels that allowed tidal water to flow in and out of the lower chambers. The purpose of these sea-connected passages has been debated. Defensive flooding, water supply, concealed access, but their existence is documented and their engineering is sophisticated. Atlit was not an anomaly. Across the Levant, Templar sites featured underground tunnel systems, concealed storage chambers, and hydraulic water management networks that controlled flow, pressure, and access with a precision that reflected not improvisation but institutional knowledge. The order maintained its own core of builders, stonemasons, and engineers. Construction techniques were standardized across commanderies, which passed from one generation of brothers to the next as part of the order's operational infrastructure. The parallels to Oak Island are structural, not symbolic. Flood tunnels, triggered by excavation, tide-dependent water systems connected to the sea, layered underground construction designed to protect a central deposit. The resemblance is not casual, it is technical, specific, and consistent with a building tradition refined over 200 years of continuous practice. But resemblance across centuries and continents is not a direct link. The gap between capability and proof remains open, wide, and watched from both sides. Before there were banks, there were Templars. The order's financial innovation is one of the most consequential and least romanticized aspects of its history. A pilgrim traveling to the Holy Land could deposit funds at a Templar commandery in London or Paris, receive a coded receipt, and withdraw equivalent value upon arrival in Jerusalem, a transaction spanning thousands of miles, conducted through an organization that operated across borders, languages, and political jurisdictions. It was, in practical terms, the first international banking system, and it ran on secrecy. The physical infrastructure of this system required secure vaulting, not merely strong rooms with heavy doors, but distributed networks of concealed storage that could survive siege, political upheaval, and betrayal. The Templars moved gold, silver, documents, and sacred relics across vast distances using trusted couriers, coded communication, and routes known only to senior members of the order. The logistics of concealment were not peripheral to Templar operations, they were central. The order existed in part to protect things that powerful people wanted to seize. This organizational experience matters when considering Oak Island. If the Templars did reach Nova Scotia, and the circumstantial thread from La Rochelle to Scotland to the Sinclair voyage suggests they may have, they would not have arrived as amateurs in the art of hiding. They would have carried with them an institutional tradition of secure transport, concealed storage, and coded access refined across 2 centuries of high-stakes practice. Every skill required to build what exists on Oak Island was already present within the Order's operational DNA, but capability is not evidence. The Templars could have built it. That is not the same as proving they did. And no artifact bearing a Templar seal, a Templar inscription, or a Templar provenance has been conclusively recovered from Oak Island's soil. The Templars did not write plainly. From the earliest decades of the Order's existence, internal communication relied on coded systems, ciphers, symbolic shorthand, and geometric encoding methods that kept sensitive information legible only to those who held the key. This was not paranoia, it was operational necessity. An order that managed international finances, guarded religious relics, and maintained military intelligence across a war zone could not afford intercepted messages. The cipher systems attributed to the Templars drew on multiple traditions. The Cistercian numeral system, a compact method of encoding numbers into geometric shapes, developed within the monastic order, from which the Templars drew their rule, allowed complex numerical information to be recorded in minimal space. Templar cross-based encoding used variations on the order's signature symbol to represent letters, directions, or coordinates. Architectural encoding embedded information directly into the proportions and orientations of buildings, readable only by those trained to extract meaning from measurement. Now consider the inscribed stone reportedly found at 90 feet in the Money Pit, a flat slab bearing symbols no local scholar could identify. The symbols were not Latin, not runic, not Mi'kmaq. They belonged to no recognized alphabet of the colonial period. One later interpretation rendered them as a substitution cipher, but the stone itself vanished before independent analysis could be performed. If those symbols belong to a Templar cipher tradition, they may not have been a message in the ordinary sense. They may have been a key, a piece of encoded information designed to unlock or locate something else within the island's larger geometric system. But a key implies a lock, and a lock implies an intended user. Whoever carved that stone anticipated that someone at some future point would find it and possess the knowledge to read it. The cipher was not meant for everyone. It was meant for a specific audience, an audience that, 7 centuries later, has never been identified and may no longer exist. In 1897, a drilling operation probing the depths of the Money Pit brought something to the surface that changed the nature of every question that had been asked about Oak Island. It was not gold, it was not gemstone, it was a tiny fragment of parchment, a scrap of animal skin bearing what appeared to be handwritten characters in ink. The fragment was recovered from a drill core extracted at a depth of approximately 150 feet, well below the flood zone that had defeated every previous attempt at excavation. The parchment was examined and subjected to chemical analysis. The ink appeared to be consistent with iron gall composition, a type widely used in medieval European manuscript production. The handwriting, what little could be discerned from the fragment's damaged surface, suggested deliberate, practiced letter forms rather than casual marking. The controversy was immediate. Skeptics argued the fragment could have been contamination, a piece of material introduced into the borehole during drilling, perhaps from a label on equipment or a scrap of paper carried by a worker. Proponents countered that the depth and condition of the fragment made surface contamination unlikely, and that the drill core had passed through undisturbed clay before reaching the deposit level. The debate has never been conclusively resolved because the fragment itself, like so much evidence from Oak Island, is too small and too degraded to support definitive analysis. But the implication of authenticity is staggering. If the parchment is genuine, if a written document was deliberately placed at extreme depth inside a hydraulically sealed, flood-protected shaft, then the entire premise of the Oak Island mystery shifts. The works were not built to protect coins or bullion. They were built to protect a text. Someone considered a piece of writing so dangerous, so valuable, or so sacred that they engineered an island-scale defense system to ensure it would survive centuries underground. The question is no longer what was buried. The question is what was written. The parchment was not the only organic material recovered from the deep sections of the money pit. Subsequent drilling operations, conducted across multiple decades and by different teams, brought up fragments that forensic analysis identified as human bone. Alongside the bone, investigators recovered small pieces of what appeared to be leather bookbinding material, thin, processed animal hide of the kind used in medieval and early modern manuscript covers. The bone fragments were subjected to analysis, though the results have been contested. Initial assessments suggested the remains were of European or Middle Eastern origin, consistent with skeletal markers found in populations from those regions. Dating estimates placed the bones at several centuries old, though the margin of error was wide enough to encompass multiple historical periods. Critics challenged the sample size, the chain of custody, and the reliability of forensic analysis performed on fragments recovered from a drill core rather than a controlled excavation. The scientific community has not reached consensus, but the presence of human remains inside a sealed, flood-protected shaft demands a different kind of question than treasure ever did. Bones at 150 feet below ground, beneath layers of log platforms and a hydraulic defense system, were not placed there casually. They were not the result of an accident. Someone was interred deliberately at depth inside a structure specifically designed to prevent unauthorized access. The possibilities are few, and none of them are comfortable. The remains could represent a deliberate burial. A body placed alongside whatever else the shaft contains is a guardian, a companion, or a sacrifice. They could represent someone who entered the shaft before it was sealed and never emerged. Or they could represent a figure of such significance that their physical remains were considered part of the deposit, inseparable from the documents or relics they accompanied. To the bookbinding material found alongside the bone narrows the interpretation further. Whatever was placed in that shaft was meant to be read. The bones and the binding share the same darkness, the same silence, and the same refusal to explain themselves. There is a word for a structure built to house sacred remains. It is called a reliquary. In the medieval Christian world, reliquaries were not simple containers. They were theological architecture, vessels designed with extraordinary care, often exceeding the apparent value of their contents, because the act of protection was itself a form of devotion. Gold caskets held bone fragments, jeweled boxes contained scraps of cloth. Entire chapel crypts were constructed to preserve a single relic believed to carry divine proximity. The container honored what it held by making access difficult and desecration unthinkable. Now consider Oak Island, a shaft sunk over 100 feet into bedrock, a hydraulic flood system connected to the sea designed to destroy any unauthorized attempt at recovery, an artificial beach concealing the mechanism, a network of geometric markers encoding location and orientation across the island's surface. Inside the shaft, parchment, book-binding leather, and human bone. The structure is not a vault, it is not a bunker, it is not a treasury. It behaves in every functional respect like a reliquary, scaled up from chapel crypt to island, from gold casket to engineered landscape. The Templar connection deepens this reading considerably. The order was not merely a military and financial institution, it was a religious brotherhood, and relic veneration stood at the center of its spiritual identity. Templars guarded fragments of the true cross, pieces of saints' remains, and due to, according to persistent and unverifiable legend, artifacts recovered from beneath the Temple of Solomon during the order's earliest years in Jerusalem. Among the most enduring of these legends is the claim that the Templars discovered documents predating Orthodox Christian scripture, texts whose contents, if made public, would have destabilized the theological foundations of the medieval church, if such documents existed, and if the Templars transported them out of France aboard the fleet that vanished from La Rochelle. The construction of an island-scale reliquary in the New World begins to make strategic sense. The contents would not have been dangerous because of their material worth. They would have been dangerous because of what they said. Protecting them required not a locked room, but a system designed to outlast kingdoms, resist technology, and remain sealed until the right reader arrived, or until no reader was left to threaten what they revealed. Whatever those documents contain, they remain exactly where they were placed. The reliquary has not been breached. The silence holds. Numbers are supposed to settle arguments. Carbon dating exists precisely to end the kind of speculation that surrounds Oak Island, to replace theory with measurement, narrative with isotope. But when the technique was applied to materials recovered from the island, it did not settle anything. It made everything worse. Samples of coconut fiber from Smith's Cove returned dates ranging from the 12th to the 14th centuries. Wood from the log platforms in the Money Pit produced dates scattered across the 1400s and 1500s. Fragments of other organic material recovered from various depths offered still different ranges, some clustering in the 1600s, others reaching back to periods well before any recognized European contact with the region. No single consistent date emerged, and the results did not converge on a century, let alone a decade. There are two ways to interpret the spread. The first is contamination, that the samples were degraded, mixed with younger material, or improperly handled during collection. This is plausible. Drill core sampling in a flooded, disturbed shaft is not a controlled laboratory environment, but contamination typically skews results in one direction. The Oak Island dates scatter across 400 years with no clear bias, which is unusual for simple contamination. The second interpretation is more unsettling. If the dates are broadly accurate, they suggest not a single construction event, but multiple phases of activity spanning centuries, meaning the site was not built once and abandoned, but built, maintained, and possibly expanded over generations. That would require continuity of knowledge, purpose, and access across a time frame that no known local group can account for. Neither reading resolves anything. Both open corridors that lead deeper into the dark. There's a pattern in the Oak Island story that has nothing to do with geology or engineering. It appears in the biographies of the men who kept coming back to the island, a connection so consistent that ignoring it requires more effort than acknowledging it. But many of the principal figures in the Oak Island treasure hunt across multiple generations were Freemasons. The connection begins early. Several members of the Onslow Company, which conducted the first major excavation in 1803, had documented Masonic affiliations. Later, treasure syndicates included prominent lodge members. Frederick Blair, who drove the investigation through the late 19th and early 20th centuries and oversaw the drilling that recovered the parchment fragment, was a Mason. In the modern era, investigators and financiers connected to the ongoing search have maintained similar affiliations. The Masonic thread does not appear in one chapter of the island's history. It runs through the entire narrative. This would be unremarkable if Freemasonry were not itself entangled with the Templar legacy. Masonic tradition claims symbolic descent from the builders of the Temple of Solomon, the same temple beneath which the Templars are said to have excavated during their earliest years in Jerusalem. Masonic ritual, iconography, and degree structures share documented overlaps with Templar practices. The relationship between the two traditions is debated by historians, but the symbolic lineage is openly acknowledged within Masonic literature itself. The question, then, is not whether Masons were involved in the Oak Island search. They demonstrably were. The question is why. Were they drawn by the same curiosity that attracted everyone else? The legend, the challenge, the promise of gold? Or did certain lodge traditions carry privately transmitted knowledge about the island? Knowledge passed not through public record, but through fraternal channels, from one initiate to the next, pointing always toward the same coordinates on the same cold Atlantic shore? There is one more thread, and it begins where the Templar story itself begins, in France. The fleet sailed from La Rochelle, a French Atlantic port. The order's suppression was orchestrated by a French king, and scattered across the margins of the Oak Island investigation are traces suggesting that the French dimension of this mystery did not end in 1307. A stone found in the broader Oak Island area reportedly bore an inscription in French, not English, not Latin, but the language of the Templar heartland. Acadian settlers, French-speaking colonists who populated Nova Scotia from the early 17th century, maintained a presence in the Mahone Bay region for generations. Some researchers have noted unexplained activity near the island during the Acadian period, references too vague to constitute proof, but too persistent to constitute nothing. If French-speaking intermediaries were involved in the Oak Island works, not as original builders, but as custodians, maintainers, or later contributors, the project takes on a different temporal shape. It ceases to be a single expedition and becomes a sustained, multi-generational effort coordinated from or connected to European networks. The carbon dating spread, with its centuries-wide scatter, suddenly fits a pattern, not contamination, but continuation. And the silence in the French colonial record begins to look different too. Acadian archives are incomplete. Much was destroyed during the British expulsion of the 1750s, but what survives contains no mention of Oak Island activity. That absence, viewed against the possibility of deliberate custodianship, feels less like a gap and more like a carefully maintained omission. Every theory about Oak Island eventually confronts the same immovable fact, and it is the one that should have ended the debate long ago, not by answering the mystery, but by redefining it after more than 200 years of continuous effort involving millions of dollars, increasingly advanced technology, and the relentless attention of engineers, investors, and excavation teams across multiple centuries, no one has recovered the central deposit. The shaft has never been fully penetrated. The flood system still functions. Let that settle for a moment. The defense mechanism designed by the original builders, whoever they were, has successfully repelled every attempt at recovery for over 2 centuries. Industrial pumps have failed to overcome it. Steel caissons have collapsed against it. Modern drilling technology has reached the deposit zone, but has not been able to extract its contents intact. The system was built with pre-industrial materials, stone, wood, coconut fiber, eelgrass, and it continues to operate against tools its designers could not possibly have imagined. This is not a trivial observation. It is the single most destabilizing fact in the entire investigation. No pirate crew possessed the engineering knowledge to build a defense system that could resist 19th century industrial technology, let alone 21st century methods. No colonial military engineer designed fortifications with a 200-year operational horizon against unknown future adversaries. The endurance of the flood system exceeds every explanation that has been offered for its origin, which leaves 2 possibilities, and neither one is reassuring. Either the engineering is significantly more advanced than any proposed builder has been credibly shown to possess, meaning the builder's identity is even more mysterious than currently acknowledged, or the assumption guiding every excavation attempt is itself wrong. Every team has dug vertically, following the shaft downward, fighting the flood system head on. But what if vertical penetration was never the intended method of access? What if the shaft is the lock and the real entry, the door the builders designed for themselves, is somewhere else entirely, still hidden, still waiting, still untouched? We began at Smith's Cove. It is right that we return there because the Cove is not a detail in this story. It is the signature. Everything that has been examined across 9 chapters, the Templar fleet, the Sinclair voyage, the sacred geometry, the parchment, and the bone, flows backward through the narrative and arrives here at a beach that was never a beach, on an island that was never what it appeared to be. The artificial beach at Smith's Cove was not a practical convenience. It was a philosophical statement. Whoever built the flood system did not simply connect their drainage channels to the ocean and leave them exposed. They buried the channels beneath manufactured sand. They covered the stone drains with layers of coconut fiber and eelgrass. They built, on top of an engineering masterpiece, the appearance of nothing, an ordinary shoreline, indistinguishable from any other cove on any other island in Mahone Bay. Concealment was not an afterthought, it was the foundational design principle. The builders did not want the flood system found. They did not want the drains identified. They did not want anyone to look at Smith's Cove and see anything other than waves breaking on rock and sand. As the beach was discovered only by accident, by treasure hunters digging near the waterline who happened to break through the surface layer and expose what lay beneath. And this is the realization that should keep every investigator awake at night. If Smith's Cove was designed to be invisible and was found only through chance, then the question is not what has been discovered on Oak Island. The question is what has not been discovered. What other systems, markers, or structures remain hidden beneath surfaces that still look natural? What has been walked over, sailed past, or dismissed for 200 years because the concealment worked exactly as intended? Consider what is missing. The inscribed stone, the only artifact ever removed from the money pit bearing a direct inscription from the builders, disappeared from a bookbinder's shop under circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. The parchment fragment recovered from 150 feet below ground was too small and too degraded for conclusive analysis and has since been lost to the archival record. The Templar fleet records from La Rochelle either never existed or were destroyed so thoroughly that not a single page survives. The vaults beneath Rosslyn Chapel remain sealed by institutional decision. The Zeno letters exist in a single published edition with no corroborating manuscript. These are not random losses. They are not the normal entropy of historical evidence degrading over centuries. Each piece of missing evidence occupied a critical position in the evidentiary chain, and each vanished at precisely the moment its significance became apparent. The inscribed stone disappeared after it was removed from the pit and displayed publicly. The fleet records vanished during or immediately after the suppression of the order. The Rosslyn vaults were sealed and have been kept sealed through deliberate, ongoing institutional choice. In a mystery this old and this layered, what has been removed is as important as what remains. Absence is not neutral. It carries information about who had access, who had motive, and who had the power to make evidence disappear. The pattern is too consistent and too precisely targeted to attribute entirely to negligence, accident, or the passage of time. Someone has been managing this story, not in a single dramatic act of suppression, but through a sustained, quiet, centuries-long process of removal, pulling key threads from the evidentiary fabric at intervals spread across hundreds of years. Whether that management originates from a single continuous tradition or from multiple unrelated actors responding to the same instinct for concealment, the effect is identical. The evidence that would resolve the mystery has been systematically made unavailable, and the unavailability itself is the loudest signal in the entire investigation. Here is what we know. An artificial beach conceals a hydraulic flood system at Smith's Cove. That flood system protects a shaft sunk over 100 feet into Oak Island's bedrock. Inside that shaft, drilling has recovered parchment, book-binding leather, and human bone. Across the island's surface, geometric markers across a triangle, drilled reference points, encode spatial information in proportions consistent with Templar sacred geometry. A Templar fleet vanished from La Rochelle in 1307 and was never found. A Sinclair prince may have crossed the Atlantic in 1398. Rosslyn Chapel contains carvings of New World plants predating Columbus. Carbon dating places materials on the island across a range spanning the 13th to the 17th centuries. The evidence connecting the Knights Templar to Oak Island is extensive. It is internally consistent. It spans multiple disciplines: engineering, architecture, botany, navigation, cryptography, forensic anthropology, and it is entirely circumstantial. No single artifact has been recovered from Oak Island that bears a Templar name, a Templar seal, or a Templar inscription in any recognized form. The connection is built from convergences, not confirmations, from the accumulation of parallels that individually prove nothing and collectively resist dismissal. This is the paradox that defines the mystery and ensures it will continue. No alternative theory, pirates, colonial military, privateers, or any other proposed builder, accounts for the engineering sophistication, the geometric encoding, the transatlantic logistics, and the century-spanning secrecy as coherently as the Templar hypothesis. And yet the Templar hypothesis cannot be proven. because the one thing that would prove it remains locked inside the very structure the theory seeks to explain. The flood tunnels still carry seawater into the shaft with every rising tide. The deposit, whatever it is, remains sealed at depth, protected by a system that has outlasted every technology sent against it. The mystery of Smith's Cove does not end here because it has not ended in the physical world. The island is still engineered. The beach is still artificial. The water still rises. And the most important question may no longer be what is buried beneath Oak Island, but why it has been made so profoundly, so structurally, so permanently certain that we will never be allowed to find out.